Ivavik is right on the boundary with Vuntut, or with the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Eastern Alaska, which I'm sure some of your members have visited and certainly would know about. Ivavik is the place for giving birth, or a nursery. And that refers to the porcupine caribou herd, which of course is shared between Alaska and the Yukon and Northwest Territories, and the Inuvialuit, the Inuit, and the Gwich'in people. And then we get to Tuktoyaknogait National Park. And Tuktoyaknogait also refers to caribou, and that it's young caribou. And this refers to the blue-nosed west caribou herd. And I think at that we'll move on to the next slide. And just giving an idea of where, in terms of latitude, these parks are. And all of the places that we're visiting are north of the Arctic Circle, which is at 66.5 degrees. And of course, the significance of the Arctic Circle is that north of that, you'll have periods varying day lengths, but most of the time you'll have some amount of days that have the sun never sets, so land of 24-hour sunlight. And conversely, you can get 24 hours of darkness in the furthest north areas. I spent, after working in Olivic for 6 months, I spent 6 months in Inuvik, which is about there. And we had 6 weeks in December to the beginning of early January, where we did not have any direct sunlight. So it was just sort of dusky conditions. The daylight would kind of come about 10:30 in the morning, and by 2 o'clock it was dark again. And that daylight was such that the street lights didn't even turn off. So you can get an idea. And I used to make sure I went out for an hour and walked home for lunch, because that was the only time I saw daylight. Now I'll turn it over to Peter to talk about the physiographic regions.
You've just seen where the Arctic Circle is there, but perhaps biologically what's more important is where tree line is. As you can see here, tree line comes quite a bit south, especially around Hudson's Bay. They're quite a bit south of where the Arctic Circle was. The Arctic Circle was kind of coming across through here. The next, yeah, the Arctic is not one big uniform chunk, but it's broken into what we call the low Arctic and the high Arctic. And biologically, the low Arctic, again, being further south, is a bit warmer, it's a bit more productive, a bit more vegetation cover, as you see, whereas in the high Arctic, perhaps the tallest shrubs are much less than knee high, the productivity is much less. It's a lot drier. The Arctic islands, mean annual precipitation is maybe 6 inches, 8 inches, that kind of thing, and it's quite a bit more moisture further south. So the northern Arctic, the high Arctic rather, is really often called a desert or a semi-desert, a polar desert. Another factor which has affected the biota there was the peak of the Wisconsin period. The last big push or cold period in the Pleistocene was about 18,000 years ago, but there were goodly sized portions in the Arctic that were not glaciated at that time. As you can see, most of Alaska, everything north of this black line, basically was ice free. So most of Alaska over into adjoining eastern Siberia, a piece into the Yukon, and then up through the Arctic Islands here. And there's a bit coming down the east side of Ellesmere Island here, and the east side of Baffin Island also was unglaciated. I didn't draw that line. So the Arctic is a large area. It's a varied area. One other thing I should mention has to do with the geology, with the physiography. This portion here on the mainland, a lot of this is underlain by Canadian shield. Think of the kinds of rocks they're say in the Boundary Waters canoe area. I know that's not north of the tree line, but that kind of exposed bedrock is what's typical in this area. Over here in the Western Arctic and up into a lot of the islands, the sediments are much more flat-lying. A lot of the topographic relief basically goes down from plateaus, whereas over on the east side of Ellesmere and down through Baffin Island here are islands. So all of these things add to the biological diversity in this area.
So we thought it might also give an idea of the remoteness of these parks to show what the visitation was and compare it to parks that we're well familiar with, such as Glacier, Waterton Lakes, Banff, and Jasper. And these are numbers from 2019. And for instance, here, Tuktoyaknulgait National Park, I think 14 is kind of a high number. When we were there in 2004, we were a party of 6. We were the only visitors that year. So, you know, there were probably some park patrols and perhaps some Inuvialuit who had come into the park to hunt or to other cultural practices. Now, you also notice there are a couple that have higher numbers, such as Avavik, and that's the park in the North Yukon that's next to Anwar. And the numbers there reflect the Firth River rafting attraction. So commercial outfitters offer raft tours on the Firth River, as well as private parties can get a permit too. The highest number of visitors are in Inuviatuk, and you might think, well, gosh, that looked pretty remote on eastern Baffin Island, but actually it's pretty well serviced by scheduled commercial flights from Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut. There's flights that go to Pangnirtung, and at Pangnirtung, in the summer, you can get a boat ride right to the park, or in the winter, a snowmobile ride. So it does attract quite a few hikers. And as we'll explain in a little while, a lot of climbers come to Baffin Island for the very steep, extensive climbing faces on these mountains. So we'll get on with it then and visit Olivic National Park. So access to Olivic is from Inuvik, which is the main community in the Mackenzie Delta, and flights to Sax Harbor. And then from Sax Harbor, we would have to charter a twin otter and fly into Olivic National Park. And like I mentioned, I worked for Olivic, and I arrived there in mid-April, and it was already 24-hour daylight, just bordering on 24-hour sunlight, but it was still winter. It was still pretty cold. And this is the community of Sax Harbor here, not very large, a couple hundred people living there. And in the summer, it does melt out. And initially, it was a occasional hunting camp for Inuvialuit people. And the whaling boats would stop in the harbor here. And then starting in the 1950s, it became more of a permanent settlement. One of the first things I was able to do was get myself involved with the Canadian Wildlife Service study on snow geese, the lesser snow geese. And so I joined a team that was studying the habitat in the Egg River area on Western Banks Island. And this area, Banks Island, actually has 95% of the Western Arctic population of snow geese. And it's about 500,000 geese nest on Banks Island. And that's about 15% of the Canadian population. One of the things that we did later in the summer, I joined them again. And as all waterfowl do, they become flightless when they are molting their flight feathers. And so we had the help of a helicopter on pontoons, on floats, to slowly move the birds towards shore where we could trap them in a pen and then subsequently band them. And here's comparing a snow goose and a Ross's goose. And the Ross's being a little bit smaller. Now, one of the things that I found interesting is recently in 2019, in July 2019, Canadian Wildlife Service put radio collars on 8 snow geese. And this shows their flights over the following 2 years. And I'm sure before this radio telemetry, no one realized how extensive the movement these birds made across the Arctic, and not just going straight north and south. But you do notice that most of them do come through Saskatchewan, Alberta, the prairie potholes region, the grain fields there, and then they seem to split into two. They go either towards the Sacramento Valley in California, or they carry on down the Mississippi, Missouri area into Kansas, Arkansas. And interestingly, this one bird here, after nesting for 2 years on Banks Island, the following year went to the Eastern Arctic in Southampton Island, which is quite incredible. So, and you can find this on the website, if you wanted to look it up there, and you can click on each of these individuals, and it's called the Lesser Snow Goose Migration GPS Tracking. And so I think if you just put any of those or Banks Island, GPS snow geese, you'll be able to find that. So pretty interesting. Now, the other attraction to Banks Island is Musk Ox. And as you can see, this whole area, there's often more water than land from the air is what it seems like. And really, it's just such a pleasure to see these animals. They're smaller than they appear. A lot of that's just hair, long hair. And actually, well, we'll show some of that later. But the numbers, though, on Banks Island have really taken a hit. When I was there in the 2000s, let me just look it up so I got the right number here. Well, I'm thinking back, looking at my notes here, some of those geese and those GPS tracking have stopped at Freezeout Lake in Montana, which I'm sure quite a few of you have visited on the snow goose migration. So in 2000, there were about 70,000 musk ox on Banks Island, and they did a survey in 2019, and they estimated only 9,000 to 12,000. So we'll also talk about some of the declining caribou numbers, and a lot of these problems relate to warming in the Arctic and freezing rain events that then cause a crust on the surface of the snow. And these animals are no longer then able to paw down and get at the vegetation, whether it's sedges or lichen, in the case of caribou, for them to feed on. Now, the Arctic is a fairly nutrient poor environment. So whenever you get an animal that dies, the muskox, that's really recycling nutrients, and you'll get lots of vegetation in the area. Down here, you can see there's even a lemming who's taken up residence in amongst this bison skull, or bison muskox skull. And here is what's called kiviot. And I'm not sure how many have heard of kiviot, but I'll hold some up. This is the soft underfur that the muskox have under those long guard hairs. And it's very highly sought after for knitting into warm sweaters and toques, mitts, and so on. And I collected this just off the land, like you can see here with the kiviot that's been rubbed on the rock, that it's also on shrubs. And one of the elders I met in Sachs Harbor, Lena Wolke, who did knit and sell products from kiviot, she didn't like this dirty stuff you pick off the ground, and she was able to go out and shoot a muskox when she needed more kiviot. And that way she had the cleanest, highest quality product. There's also a little show and tell in muskox. Here's a little muskox that my friend, an elder, Sarah Koptana, had made and given to me. It's got real muskox fur on it. And there was a local carver who did a lot of carving using muskox horn. So I'll try to hold this up where you can see. So he's cleared the horn, and then he's attached these. It's are in this case swans. So this is muskox carving. So you'd go by his place, and through the summer you'd see, muskox skulls melting out from beside his house. Now, there's lots of other wildlife on the island, eiders, and you might wonder what's in this picture, but if you look right there, we have a female eider that is sticking tight to her nest, and they're known for playing dead. Virtually, I've seen pictures where people have picked them up, moved them off the nest to get a picture, and they don't fly away, they don't move. They just so rely on their camouflage to protect them. Black-bellied plover. I wish I would have had a nice digital camera at that time. I could have probably gotten much better bird pictures. So the plover's nest is quite open on the ground compared to the Lapland longspur, which you can just see over here. And they're in a little bit more vegetation, and they actually create a nest from vegetation, a nest cup. Now, there are 2 species of ptarmigan in the Arctic, and basically they're segregated roughly by habitat, as the name suggests. The rock, more barren ground, rock ptarmigan and willow ptarmigan that are in more of the vegetation, and definitely in some willow habitats. Oops. So the red phalarope, for those of you that don't know, this is a species that's called a polyandrous species. So the female is the colorful one. So this is a female red phalarope, and she will lay her eggs and then she takes off and leaves the male to incubate the eggs and to raise the young ones. Meanwhile, she goes off and finds another mate and lays another set of eggs. And she can do that 2 or 3 times in the spring if she can find other mates to that do not have a nest to incubate yet. Red-throated loons were relatively common on the lakes. And again, they make a similar kind of a semi-floating nest in aquatic habitat like the common loon does. Now, the prairie caribou is a subspecies of the barren ground caribou that's just found on the Arctic islands. It's non-migratory, so it's a year-round resident there. It's suffered even more declines than the regular barren ground caribou. Just look it up here, make sure I get the numbers right. So in 1982, there was an estimated 10,000 prairie caribou on Banks Island alone. And in 2019, the estimate was 1,500 to 2,500 animals. And again, they've been hit by some really bad winters where they've had that ice crust they can't paw through. Now, some of the other mammals are Arctic hare, which when you first see them on that, in that landscape, you're thinking they're much larger than they are. And they are a large hare. Arctic fox, this one was just starting to shed its winter fur into its summer coat. And the collared lemming. And the collared lemming is a critical species for all of the raptors and the foxes in the Arctic, and probably wolves to a certain extent as well. I'm not sure, I can't get any feedback from people if you can figure out what's in this picture, but if you look right here, we have a short-eared owl. In 2000, when we were there, we documented 2 nests of short-eared owls in the park, and those were the first nesting records on Banks Island. And there may have been a 3rd nest as well. We saw an adult, but we never found a nest. Now, and also that year, every 5 years, the Northwest Territories government, the biologists do a raptor survey, particularly focusing on peregrine falcons and gyrfalcons, but all other raptor species too. And so we were tracking rough-legged hawks. And probably a number of you are familiar with them because in the winter, they will come all the way down into the Great Plains to find places where they can hunt that are relatively snow-free. And the snowy owl, which is sort of the ghost of the tundra, a really amazing bird. And this is one of their nest sites. And perhaps you'll notice these are all lemmings piled up around the edge of the nest. There was one nest where we counted 23 lemming carcasses around the nest. It was a really high lemming number year, and like, come on, kids, eat up, eat up. But they weren't able to keep up to the delivery prowess of the male and female of the pair. And then this bird, a few months or a month or so older, where it's getting kind of ferocious looking. It was hissing at us. You don't get too close to it. And then peregrine falcons, you'll see the eggs, they nest right kind of at the bottom of a cliff or on a cliff edge. Really beautiful little kind of copper colored eggs. And you want to be very cautious, and it's helpful to have a partner watching because they're known to attack, and you don't want to be hit in the head by the talons from these birds. And what can I say? These are what I think is cuteness personified, Arctic fox pups. And they were just totally oblivious to our presence. They were playing. This was the evening sun, kind of curious about us. Can you come and play? Anybody want to play with me? So they're just gorgeous animals. And you can see they're in their summer brown, and then they will molt into the winter whites in a few months, or actually probably a month or so later than the picture was taken. The Thompson River is the main river on Banks Island, and the little bit of tourism that does come to Olivic National Park, it's generally people who are canoeing the Thompson River. There's no rapids on it. When I was there on a trip, and the first day we saw Musk Ox, and I went to fill out a wildlife card, and it talks about elevation. So I looked on the map, and I looked at it twice, and it said 100 feet. And we were still 100 kilometers from the ocean. So at that point, I knew there would be no rapids on the river. But there are these sandy islands in the river, and that's where there's a lot of birds' nests, because the mammals tend not to bother trying to get there to predate their nests. So glaucous gull, there is a bird on that little hilltop there, and it's a black brant, which is is a goose. And I'll turn it over to Peter to talk a little bit about some of the plants of this sandy habitat.
Okay, we'll just give you a look at some of the species here and try to maybe relate them to coming further south. A lot of these species have a so-called Arctic alpine distribution, where they're above latitudinal tree line in the Arctic, and they come south in the Rocky Mountains, and they are above altitudinal tree line. So this is one that actually, the astragalus here, the milkvetch, is actually has undergone some name changes. You may know this is Astragalus aboriginum, and it's a species that comes down through Alberta down into Montana. This form that's on Banks Island is called Richardson's. It's kind of an Arctic form in this wide-ranging circumpolar species. Armeria merita, the thrift, is a common circumboreal plant, and it provides, as you can see here, some nectar for the polar fritillary. A couple other plants you may know, Crapus nana has been renamed to Askelia, the dwarf hawksbeard. Again, that makes it down through Montana in the Alpine. And then a couple of the Arnica there is one which you'll see in the Rocky Mountains, another Arctic alpine, upper subalpine species. And then the Chrysanthemum integrifolium is a circumpolar species. And the Greenland sulfur is a butterfly which uses the Arnicas as well in this area.
Okay, I'll switch back to talking about the birds. The Jaeger are really kind of almost a raptor. They do predate on other birds' nests and eggs and chicks, and were quite common, the Pomeranian Jaeger and the long-tailed Jaeger. They're also known for attacking anybody. I almost stepped on this nest, which was just a depression in the ground, and the egg and the chick, because I was so paying attention to the adult who was dive bombing me that I wasn't watching where my feet were all the time. We have a number of lichen species. I don't know if there's anything much to be said. Some of these are obviously food for the caribou, as we mentioned. I always like that the common names is dead man's fingers for the lichen in the upper right. Sudetan or Sudetan?
Sudetan.
Sudetan.
Yeah, this is a circumpolar species of lousewort, which also gets down into Central Europe, where Sudetan land is, you may remember. Anyway, it's in Central Europe.
In the Arctic woolly bear, this caterpillar can be in that stage for up to 14 years, can freeze solid in the winter. And as a result, it has been studied by scientists trying to determine how they can do that and how that could be studied and adapted for work with surgery or in human health. And the adult moth is then does not eat. When it hatches out, it only reproduces and then dies. So it's kind of a very interesting life cycle. And this patterned ground is the result of permafrost underlying all of the Arctic area. And these ice wedges form through freeze-thaw actions. And then the ponds, the water stays there because it can't drain away because there's this layer of ice underneath. And this is what that looks like when you're kind of looking across the landscape. And it's very tricky to try to walk through. You spend a lot of time going out and around. when I was helping the Canadian Wildlife Service with that habitat, we were using a GPS and we were trying to do kilometer-long transects, counting goose nests and looking at what the habitat was. And we kept having to veer off to go around a pond, and it takes a lot of extra effort. But it's also important breeding areas for birds and really plant life, because there's so much water there. And who would ever think that this little bird would grow up to be an adult sandhill crane? It's the only time I've seen a little chick this young. But the other thing that's quite common to the Arctic, of course, is the cultural aspect. And it's been a history of over 3,500 years, from the time of the pre-Dorset people up to the Inuvialuit of today. And this site here is called Head Hill, and it's named that by the archaeologist, because there's over 500 Musk Ox skulls in this area, something like 70 food caches and 30 tent rings. But throughout, when we'd be canoeing down the river, almost every hilltop had some evidence of prior Aboriginal use. A lot of them were food caches, where they would perhaps hunt, and then they would leave food and cover it up with piles of rocks to protect it from foxes and wolves getting into the meat. Now, probably why Head Hill was so heavily used, and especially dating back to about the mid 1800s, was because of the Franklin expedition. As many of you know, Sir John Franklin went missing in 1854 in the Arctic, and the British sent out many ships and many sailors looking for him. And one of them was the HMS Investigator, captained by Captain Robert McClure. And this was almost a decade after. Franklin was 1845. And in 1853, after having been caught in the pack ice off Mercy Bay here on the north end of Banks Island, they abandoned ship, because the ship was just getting destroyed by the grinding pack ice. And so they went to shore onto this point, and that's where they stored much of what they could take off of the boat. And so the Inuvialuit would, through the decades following, came and salvaged the wood, metals, copper, iron, anything that they could find use for. And the McClure group, they did walk northeast towards Melville Island, and were eventually rescued by the HMS Resolute and made it back to England, but it was still another winter yet before they made it home. And they did lose a few individuals. There were some grave sites here at Investigator Point. Back to some flowers.
Okay, again, a look at some genera you probably know. Arctobia, the Silvery Oxytropis there is, again, an Arctic Oxytropis. The Arctic poppies are a confusing bunch right now. They're beginning to sort them out. This one on Banks, I put the name on here, the scientific name, Papaver laponicum. That's kind of a placeholder. Some of the most recent work indicates that this plant, the populaceous plant on Banks Island, is a separate species. It hasn't been described yet, but this is probably Papaver banksii or something like that that you're seeing. So just maybe see some other pictures of Arctic poppy here. Arctic poppy is one of the plants that gets furthest north in the Arctic. It's a very hardy plant. Some other plants, this Physaria, recently Lescarella arctica, the Arctic bladderpod. A wallflower, this is one, again, an Arctic alpine species, gets down into Alberta, it doesn't quite make it to Montana. And the dominant willow in the Arctic, in the high Arctic, Salix arctica here, resplendently tall of probably 4 to 5 inches. It's very much in the further south, it can, when the conditions are favorable, it can get quite a bit taller, but in much of the Arctic, this is a willow that's maybe ankle high. Cotton grass, this is very common in the lower areas in the Arctic. Some of the other species that are in these kinds of situations. The mastodon flower is a magnificent senecio that will get to be perhaps a meter tall. And the mastodon name, I think, comes from the fact that it's very hairy. It reminded someone certainly of a mastodon. And this paintbrush is the species which again gets probably furthest north in the Arctic. So a lot of paintbrushes further south, but this is the main one that we see in the Arctic. And a couple in these moisture areas, of course, for the sandpiper type birds, plovers, sandpipers nest. Okay, on to Ivivik National Park in the very northwest corner of the Yukon, about 69 degrees north, right over against Alaska here and the Anwar. This, you remember from earlier, this is low Arctic, so that they're along the streams, there are relatively high productivity shrub communities. This was a trip we took in September, and the weather was starting to turn towards fall, but it was still a wonderful fall trip. This ground cone is parasitic on mainly alders in this area. And the monkshood, again, a species which is it comes down into Alberta, about as far as Jasper, doesn't make it down into the States, but a monkshood similar to some that do occur further south. A couple other characteristic species, cloudberry, bake apple, as the name maybe implies, has a delicious taste, a big red raspberry. It grows primarily in peatland areas. And then the Labrador tea, Ledum palustri, maybe the scientific name a lot of you know, but the ledums recently have been moved into the genus Rhododendron, so it has another name, but this is a northern Labrador tea. And quite a few berry-producing plants in this area too. The Alpine Blueberry and the Vaccinium, they're the mountain cranberry, which you probably know, and the Alpine, sorry, I thought I had another name for, oh, yeah, there we go, the Alpine Bearberry. These berry plants are quite attractive to grizzly bears in the fall. When we were there in the area, these plants were just in their peak berry production, and there were quite a few grizzly bears on the landscape. They had absolutely no interest in us. You would see them out there lying on their belly grazing, and they would lift themselves up heavily and flop down a few feet further on and graze some more. And it's quite nice to see them out there on the landscape and have. Well, we couldn't have too much concern about them because had they come up to us, there was really nothing else we could climb. We did have one short encounter with one that was kind of approaching camp as we came back, and put a cracker shell up over it. And the last we saw was probably at least 3 or 4 kilometers away, still running. So I didn't really want to upset it that much, but we had no fear of grizzly bears in that area.
That's a skull bear too.
Yes, and down here in the lower left, this is what's left of a grizzly bear here. This his last bite, I guess. Again, the landscape there, low Arctic along the Babbage River. The caribou here, of course, are part of the porcupine herd, which was mentioned, which also migrates over into Anwar. This is a large, probably the largest herd of caribou in North America right now. It seems to be holding its own pretty well. And then the Mackenzie Delta, which is just to the east of the park there. Mackenzie Delta is a magnificent system. The Mackenzie River basically starts at the headwaters of Peace River, which is in northwestern or northeastern BC, and the Athabasca River in Jasper National Park. They then flow further north and form part of the main waters going to the Mackenzie. Mackenzie is the second longest river in North America, second only to the Missouri Mississippi system, and it's the largest river in Canada. This river coming south brings the water brings a lot of heat with it. So this is one place, if you might remember in the tree line diagram that I had there, where tree line really gets right up to the Beaufort Sea, to the Arctic Ocean, because of the amount of heat that's brought up by the Mackenzie River. So a tremendously productive landscape.
Okay, so we'll move on to Tuktoyaknugait National Park. As I mentioned, when we were there in 2004, this was just a personal trip. A friend of ours had moved to Inuvik to work, and I told her if she was moving there, we'd come visit. So we did, and we took along a few friends with us. And the area is very interesting, and one of the main interests is a couple of major river canyons, and this is the Hornaday River. And as Peter had mentioned, the various geology. Well, here, this sedimentary layers and the rivers cut down. So the topographical relief is down into the canyons, as opposed to going up into the mountains like you'll see in the Eastern Arctic. And we flew in by float plane. It was 2 trips. And this is actually 3 o'clock in the morning. So we left, the first trip left Inuvik about midnight. The intention was to fly out much earlier in the day, but we were waiting because the airplane was being used in some forest fire operations. And we had to wait until the plane came back, was serviced, and was ready to go again. So our friends that had gone in on the first flight, they went to bed. And when we arrived, one of them kind of crawled out and waved, but so one of the main attractions is Laurencier Falls, and this picture is maybe a little deceptive, but the falls are about 75 feet high here, and then flows down into the deeper part of the canyon. So we had a base camp for a few days where we were dropped off, and then we backpacked for 3 days across to another area where we could get picked up. And you can see we're staying to these little low ridges that were kind of rocky because everything often down below here was tussocks and really hard to walk through, very wet. And one of the, there's a few other streams leading down into the Hornaday, and quite often, and particularly in this location, there was what's called off ice. And that's an ice that forms because of overflowing river water, often in the winter. Often because behind an ice dam, it can be from groundwater seepage, and sometimes it doesn't melt all summer and will still be there throughout the season. And other small canyons. This was near one of our campsites. Talk about the saxifrage. So,
go ahead, that's yours.
Okay, so it's just quite some saxifrage and wintergreen that we encountered along the way. Again, we had a variety of habitats from wetlands to these dry ridges. Really pretty golden saxifrage. And then these areas where the snow melt comes a little later, and so it's a little moisture area and has a little bit more soil, then you get these wildflower gardens, lupins and paintbrush. Peter, being the botanist he is, he took along a half plant press because we're backpacking, so he couldn't carry a full press. He did have a permit. The superintendent of the Western Arctic Parks at the time, Alan Fair, had been a student of Peter's when Peter taught at the University of Alberta. So, and he was happy to have Peter's botanical expertise collecting plants, and because it's been very little collection done in that park. And subsequently, Peter deposited the plants at the National Museum of Nature, Canadian Museum of Nature in Ottawa. And I think some of the researchers have been in touch with him since. But of course, before going, he didn't want to carry a heavy flora either. So he made up this little provisional key to the vascular plants of Tuktoyaknugait National Park. And is an excursion. And I just kind of always chuckle at how he'd written it up here, and hastily compiled and printed by the author. I think there's only 3 copies in existence. So, if you ever find one, I'm sure they're worth a lot of money now. A colleague or a friend that was on this trip, Cheryl Bradley, is also a very good botanist. So she and Peter did an excellent job of compiling the botanical inventory of the plants we saw on the trip. And from our second base camp, we were able to hike over to the Brock River Canyon, and another spectacular landscape. And here it's known for a lot of nesting peregrine falcons, some deer falcons as well. And there has been a project down in Chile where they have peregrine falcons that winter there, and where they had again attached telemetry backpack harness And one of the birds that winters in Chile subsequently nested here on the Brock River in northern Canada. And let's see, am I doing the Horton or you?
Right. So Horton River is an area that's outside of the national parks, but is still a spectacular area and co-managed by the territorial government and the native bands. The Horton River, where we started, is right on the northern edge of tree line, and in this part of tree line, the trees are basically in these. This is kind of looking northwest, so the warmer south-facing aspects are where the trees still are, where the soils are a bit deeper, where they're more protected. This kind of an area. So the tree line here is formed by white spruce. In some areas that are less well drained, a little more peaty or muskeggy is black spruce, but this is white spruce in the upland here. This is about a 12-day canoe trip down the Horton River, going from south to north. River corridors are areas of high productivity, and this is where a lot of the animal activity is concentrated as well. So barren ground caribou here. This is part of the blue nose herd. These animals calve further north and then migrate south in the summer. Again, this herd has undergone quite a reduction in size in the past couple of decades. Past 15 years or so, its numbers have been pretty stable. Musk Ox here as well, certainly. We were very fortunate to see a wolverine came along and kind of ran alongside us on the bank of the river a bit, wanted to get to the other side, finally plunged in and swam across. We got a very good look at a wolverine. And there are also a lot of golden eagle nests along this river. On the flats, very typically this broadleafed fireweed. Again, the scientific name you may recognize this is Epilobium. This has been changed to Caminerion, so update your scientific names a bit here. Moss campion, again, a plant, an Arctic alpine species, comes south in the Rockies quite a bit. The spider plant, so named because it has runners that come out from it here. Again, there are a lot of saxifrages in the Arctic. And just a few more of the common plants that are there. Both species of poplar, both quaking aspen and balsam poplar, go quite far north, go essentially up to the shore of the Arctic Sea. They're able to, because both of them can sucker from the roots, they're able to deal with a very short growing season. And in protected areas, you'll find kind of dwarf knee-high specimens of both of these. Again, the barren ground caribou in this area, not a caribou lichen, but a lot of very colorful lichens, rhizocarpon, the yellow map lichen you probably know. Arctic ground squirrel, looking rather a fierce specimen at this scale.
This was the end of August, so the ground squirrels are already hibernating.
Yeah. Alpine bearberry, a plant which you probably know. Then moving on to Baffin Island and Ayuwituk.
Okay, this is the last of our national parks. Again, if you remember, it's the land that never melts. And flew in from Ottawa, fly north to Iqaluit, and Iqaluit's on southern Baffin Island, and this is the Meta Incognita Peninsula. And well above tree line, or getting above tree line here, and so we haven't seen any trees. From there, you take another flight to Pangnirtung, which is an Inuit community. You can see here that it's at low tide. The tides in the Eastern Arctic are fairly high, actually, and so this is all tidal flats here. People here do a lot of fishing, and then there's quite a bit of tourism opportunities into the park with the local people as well. And the national park here is a little more developed. So this is the Windy Cabin, which is a patrol cabin. At each of these sites, they also have emergency shelters because the weather can be pretty extreme. And then you can see where people have been putting up their tents. So you're not allowed to stay overnight in the shelter, but there is an emergency phone there. and it is some protection from the environment. And one of the main things I'd mentioned before was the attraction by climbers. And this is Mount Thor, and it's one of the most popular climbing routes on Baffin Island. So from the base, which we can't see because of this ridge in the way, to the summit here is 4,100 vertical feet. So about 2,500 meters. And I talked to some hikers, some climbers. They've been here for 2 weeks and they tried to climb and they still hadn't had a chance to climb. So the weather conditions can be pretty hard, and because that's a multi-day climb, so it's quite extreme. And then a little further along, this is Summit Lake. As you can imagine, it's near the summit of the pass that goes from south to north in Iowituck. And here we are looking at Mount Thor again, and you can see near the top, it's slightly overhanging, which also makes it a very extreme climb. And this is Mount Breitelblik. And this is some of that ice that never melts. And this is the Forkbeard Glacier, just one of the small named glaciers that come off the ice cap on Baffin Island. We have a friend who's a warden at Jasper National Park, and he's made numerous trips up ski mountaineering in Iowituck and other areas of Baffin National Park, or of Iowituck National Park. Over to Peter.
As I mentioned, there are a lot of saxifrages in the Arctic, and here are just 3 examples of them. The snow saxifrage, again, some scientific name updates. It used to be Saxifraga nivalis, now called Micranthes. The Bulblet Saxophage is interesting because it basically does not produce much in the way of flowers. It produces these bulblets. This is an adaptation to the very short growing season and the difficult conditions. It's a lot more sure that you can reproduce if you have some bulblets, and which are then kind of scattered by the wind. And if you're trying to get through a growing season, have somebody pollinate you and then have some seed produced. So an adaptation to the extreme conditions that can occur in the Arctic. A few other species, again, pedicularis, the louseworts, which you're probably familiar with a number of these species, and bladder campion as well. Another Oxytropus, an Arctic Oxytropus, Lapland diapensia. Diapensia is maybe a species or even a genus you're not familiar with. It's kind of an evolutionarily isolated. It's kind of maybe related to the heath family, the Ericaceae, but there are a number of these. This species is circumpolar, but does not come south, and except in the eastern mountains. It gets down into the White Mountains of New Hampshire, the Adirondacks, some of those areas. Lapland rosebay, again, is quite widespread through the Arctic, a shrubby species that again is usually less than 4 to 6 inches high. And one of the dwarfest of dwarf willows, the net-veined willow, Reticulata. Notice here on the potentilla, the cinquefoil, that in the upper left, I put the name Nivea in parentheses. Again, the taxonomy on these is in a bit of turmoil right now, and I don't know which of this is one of the Nivea group, but which of them it is, I don't know. But again, potentillas are in sunny sites in the Arctic are quite common. And of course, lichens. The one in the lower right there, the main lichen, the Alectoria. You may know Alectorias in the south, typically being epiphytes on trees, but here this species and a couple of other Alectorias in the Arctic grow on the ground, and they are grazed on by the caribou. The food value of this particular species was the Russians in the 30s, I guess, were getting low on, I'm not sure what, sugar beets or something. They haven't discovered they could make a syrup from Alectoria ochroluca here, and that has a very high extractable glucose content. So interesting. I'm not sure what that's an adaptation to, but the caribou probably take full advantage of that.
I'll stick with maple syrup.
And again, just some typical plants here. Purple saxophage, you again probably know from the above tree line alpine areas. We have harebells certainly in the alpine, and the mountain heather here, the Philodrosis cerulea, is an Arctic species of this known just north of latitudinal tree line, the species that you might know in the Rocky Mountains. The yellow flowered heather, Philodrosis glanduliflora, and the dark pink one, Philodrosis petriformis, are only found in the Rocky Mountains and kind of west to the Pacific. So this is the high Arctic, the Arctic species in this genus. And as you could see there are areas of ocean beachland, and so there are species that are adapted to this kind of habitat. The bluebells here, the Mertensia maritima, and the sea beach sandwort essentially is a thick-leaved plant that's in the Caryophyllaceae family. We were doing some research monitoring basic climate change in this area. So we were doing vegetation. We had fixed transects here. You can see the tape laid out across that, looking at cover and changes from year to year. The other portion, that two people furthest away from the picture there, were soil scientists. And one of the things we do is check as to how deep it is, what's called the active layer, the thaw layer, down to the permafrost. And so go along that line with a metal rod and penetrate down to see how deep the permafrost is. We also had a year-round station that monitored both air temperature and soil temperature, looking at how that was changing. And then one of the other studies that were involved, one of the soil scientists was looking at the dynamics of carbon in the soils in the Arctic. And as I'm sure you can appreciate, carbon cycle in the Arctic is a topic of both great interest and import in trying to understand what's happening with climate change. So going then up to northern Ellesmere, Katinnerpak National Park at about 82 degrees north. Much of this mountainous part of Ellesmere is covered with the big ice cap, with large glaciers, then coming down to lower elevation. And the northern most Parks Canada station in Katinnerpak is at Lake Hazen. And Lake Hazen was the dark building area you see there was established first as a International Geophysical Year station in the late 1950s. And there were a couple of grad students actually from McGill University spent about 18 months here, including over one whole winter, so they could begin to collect some weather data that were there. So that station that I just showed a bit ago with a data recorder in that, we just changed that battery once a year, and it came up every 6 hours, took temperatures from everywhere and stuck it away on a data recorder. These guys had to go out at least twice a day and read what was going on outside in terms of wind and all that kind of stuff, and a very different kind of thing. Now this is the most northerly sort of parks headquarters here. Get there by a Twin Otter coming in on Tundra tires. Well, before I forget to just keep this little beach here in mind. We'll talk about that just a bit later. So anyway, the Twin Otter comes in, and this is how we get in and out of that area. Some again, this being a bit of an oasis. In the low Arctic, typically you could expect several hundred vascular plant species. So in Ivavik, some of those areas, the high Arctic, typically it's less than 100. But in this part of Ellesmere here at Lake Hazen, it's a bit of an oasis. There's over 100 vascular plant species. Again, the animals, these are Musk Ox here in the center. They key in on these highly productive wetlands. Some of the other animals that are here, Arctic hare again. These differ a bit from the ones that Cyndi showed you from the low Arctic, and that these Arctic hare, because the season's so short, they stay dark or stay white all year. whereas in the south they become dark in the summer. Red knots breed here and then migrate down the Atlantic, fly way down past Chesapeake Bay, down through that area.
Probably to Tierra del Fuego at the southern
Yeah.
tip of South America.
So again, Arctic willow, the dominant shrub here. This, as it says, yellow marsh saxifrage in these wetter areas. Another species of an Arctic pedicularis, and then mountain sorrel, which probably a lot of you know from the Rocky Mountains. Again, along with the poppy, one of the species that occurs furthest north in the Arctic. Dundas Island, I had an opportunity to go there basically as a field assistant on a research project, a graduate students research project from the University of Alberta, the Canadian Wildlife Service. This is an 8x12 plywood hut, carefully fastened down with cables over the top so we don't blow away. What we're overlooking here is open water. This is in March. This area stays open because of the tidal currents through this area, so that there is ice that drifts around in it, but the water does stay open. As a result, it's a focus for a lot of wildlife activity. We were here specifically because of the walruses that come in this area. Male walruses display to attract females a lot, sort of like a lek, a lot the way that the grouse do in the prairies. They come here and they make some calls, which I'll play for you in a minute, to attract females. So we were interested, or the purpose of the research was to try to understand something about their behavior and what the calls were about, and then try to develop that as a monitoring tool. So from that hut up on top of the cliff, we ran a cable down to the edge of the water here with a hydrophone, an underwater microphone, and then put this over the edge of the water here. As Cindy mentioned, the tidal ranges here are in this area probably at least 1 to 2 meters per day, twice a day. It goes up and down, and then with storms and winds, of course, the ice will drift and pile up, forming some of these piles of ice you can see here. So we had to go down twice a day and reposition this hydrophone. There's about a 6-inch piece of pipe there that we hung over the edge, so that, because when you're having to chip out the pipe, you don't want to be chipping next to the cable. It doesn't matter if you hit the pipe a bit. So twice a day down over the edge. So one of my jobs as a field assistant also was to be a polar bear monitor, because the polar bears like to travel along the ice edge here. And of course, with the marine mammals in the area, this attracts some polar bears. Give me just a second to get things going here. And
It's always like Peter's excursion to Dundas, because you kind of wonder what's a botanist doing going to the Arctic in the middle of, or late winter when it's minus 53, but it was his opportunity to get to a pretty unique place.
Okay, here we go. That was the call the minute they came up and surfaced, and so this is what we could see out on in the Polinia there. The other animal we could often hear is the bearded seal.
those were actually calls that had been recorded while you were up there, wasn't it?
Yeah, these are from this project. There you can find them at the Cornell lab. They have bird calls and marine mammal calls. So to wrap things up here, I'm sure all of you are aware of the changes that are occurring, particularly in the Arctic because of changes in climate, environmental change. The Arctic is warming. You hear the talk about, for example, 1.5 degrees C, 2 degrees C. That's an overall average for the entire world. The Arctic is warming at 2 to 3 times more quickly than lower elevations. So we're already seeing the effects, and have been for a couple of decades, seeing the effects of climate change. One of the main effects is as the permafrost melts out, slopes become unstable. You get these kinds of slumps. It's occurring all over the Arctic. This is on Banks Island. Here's another one on the Arctic mainland, kind of a bit northwest of Tuktoyaktuk we saw there. Again, you can see there's a lot of slumping going on here. And as these slumps occur, they kind of work their way in headward. In this case, in the picture in the lower left there, working back to the right, and they capture lakes as they come along and making a lot of landscape changes. And this is also occurring in areas which are not next to lakes. This is just an upland thing. Again, on Banks Island, the two on the left and the lower, one on the lower right's up on Ellesmere Island. As you can see, these are not steep slopes. They're just areas with in which the permafrost melted, saturated the soil so much they no longer have strength, and they just start flowing downstream. As I mentioned, we have been doing monitoring of conditions on both Ellesmere Island, Kitchener-Pack, and on Baffin Island. And many of the cases that what we found overall is that the air temperatures are increasing, the soil temperatures are increasing, the depth of permafrost is increasing. And in some cases, the amount of melting of the permafrost has resulted in areas becoming drier. So this is a piece of the tundra that used to be completely vegetated. It is now dried out, and the plants have died on there. So the results of what's happening there are varied, depending a lot on the microclimate and the conditions, particular conditions around drainage in the area. This is that beach there again at Lake Hazen. A few weeks later, as there more and more meltwater coming down, filled up Lake Hazen, and that's why we had to land the Twin Otter up on the tundra there, because it couldn't land on the beach here anymore. And this is becoming an increasingly common occurrence in this area. Well, the pattern ground is caused by ice wedges which are in the ground, and then as these ice wedges melt out, the ground collapses in this way, making for travel. Hiking across this can be quite interesting. This is the ice wedge that you can see here on the edges of the polygons. Another effect, this is back to Ayuwituk, the pass through from Pangnirtung up to the north side of the island to this community called Kiktarjuak. Traditionally, the people traveled through this pass in the winter to visit, to move supplies, to go hunting. Originally, they traveled through by dog sled, and then more recently by snow machine, by skidoo. This area here, with the ice melting back, as you can see there, and with winter coming later, with snow coming later, with less snow coming, it's become increasingly difficult to get up over this because it's not getting much, if any, of a snow cover. When they come here and there's been a freezing rain, you can imagine trying to get up over that even on foot, let alone drag a skidoo with a couple of sleds behind it. It's become a real difficulty for the people to maintain the travel through this area. The other, quickly here, the other main change we're seeing is in the sea ice. This is multi-year sea ice. You can see the kind of probably an old iceberg here, and some other kinds of multi-year ice, a bit of annual ice in between. these icebergs, this multi-year ice they're rocked in the ice as the tides go back and forth. So this creates cracks around the edge of the ice, and this allows seals and walruses to live in this area because they can come up and use these as breathing holes, as haul out holes. So as increasingly we're not seeing the multi-year ice, increasingly we're not seeing icebergs, and then these areas are not favorable habitat. The other function that this ice form, these multi-year ice performs, is that it creates snow drifts, and it's in these snow drifts that the polar bears have their birthing layers. Ring seals also have their birthing layers in this area. So if you begin to lose your birthing habitat, if you're losing the way you can get up to get above the ice, your breathing holes, this area is becoming less functional as habitat. So in the lower right are walruses, the upper left there are bearded seals. I know you probably can't tell a difference, but both of these rely on these multi-year ice situations to get up onto the ice. The other issue, of course, is that as glaciers melt back, this is on Ellesmere Island, Tanqueray Fjord, these glaciers no longer reach, this is tidewater, no longer reach the ocean here. They don't put icebergs into the water, so you're ending up just with the annual ice. And again, the habitat value of this becomes much less. The ice also is becoming less dependable. It's much more difficult for the native peoples to be able to travel out to hunting areas.
And I think that's the end of it. So it's been a little different. I mean, I've been on lots of Zoom calls. I think this is my first time giving an hour-long presentation and not being able to gauge people's reactions. But thank you for sticking with us, and we're happy to answer any questions. So I guess Beth,